down, on prey, onward gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm your host, Josh Howard, and I am joined today with Josh Daws. Josh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.
So stretching you a little bit outside your box, Josh, most people would probably know you from the Great Awakening podcast. We can talk a little more about your different ventures, but a little bit of a stretch coming to an eschatology channel. So thanks on the front end for doing that. But Josh, give us a little bit of background, where you're at, where you're serving, what sort of projects you're involved in, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I'm a husband, father of four here in Georgia. We attend a Reformed Southern Baptist church, and that's not the last place I expected to find myself. Growing up a Southern Baptist pastor's kid, I ran as far away from that SBC world as I could and still remain a Christian in college, and got involved with seeker-sensitive church and worked for a big seeker-sensitive megachurch for about 10 years. So I've had a interesting journey back to the Southern Baptists and Reformed flavor. So
yeah, no, that's fantastic. So you have the podcast you do. I think you at least you write articles, and I think you've got some other stuff cooking. But like, what are your current like research projects, writing projects? Where do you find yourself putting in most of your time?
yeah, so I do a bit of writing. Recently wrote a piece for American Reformer about Christian nationalism, just kind of a primer for the layman who's maybe not hasn't been following this conversation from the beginning, and just wanted to. That conversation started kind of leaving Twitter and showing up in local church, I wanted pastors and church leaders to be prepared that if you hear somebody saying I'm a Christian nationalist, that you don't have to start church discipline proceedings. There's a lot of different flavors, ask questions. What do people mean by it? And so that was one thing I did recently. Biggest focus of my work right now is the Great Awakening podcast, like you said, where I just have guests on to talk about different areas of cultural engagement for Christians and how we can think more biblically about different issues.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I was going through earlier today. I was just, going through your podcast, different hosts you've had on, a lot of great names, a lot of great topics that you've been engaging. You had Joe Rigney on to discuss his, perennially uncontroversial topic of the sin of empathy. So that one was fantastic. I've seen a lot of people pass that one around. So yeah, I would encourage anybody that has not seen that. Joe's a hard guy to nail down. So yeah, hats off to you, Josh, for getting that one. But that was a really encouraging chat. Let's jump in, Josh. Tell me a little bit about the wokeness factor. What would cause you to jump into a podcast, and a ministry kind of targeting this thing of, as you phrased it, awakening. But why dive in, and what sort of impact do you see on that? And two of the things that were kind of in the back of my mind when I was thinking about asking you about that project is, number one, just what you just mentioned, as far as these things don't stay. They don't stay on Twitter. They don't stay in the academy. They kind of filter down into the church. And I think a lot of us have noticed that. And maybe you could speak more to that, but also just what a slow trickle down process that often is. So, when I did my first master's degree, it was back in 2005, and it was on the West Coast, and it was at a critical school, a critical sociological / criminological / whatever school. But at that point it was critical theory. But it was still kind of a West Coast thing, and to the point where I didn't even quite understand it. And then you get in there and you start hearing a lot of these things. Well, now it's, obviously it's exploded, it's everywhere. But what caused you to get interested in that? How'd you walk into that, and what's that experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, it really was originated on the West Coast for me as well. We long story, but we ended up in California for about 7.5 years, pursuing a career in the film industry there, and ended up helping to start a church there. And this was let's see, 2010 to 2017. And so we were there and started seeing a lot of the social justice stuff come into the church. But Black Lives Matter was really big. And so a lot of people we were in church with started, becoming concerned about those issues. And we just kind of watched over the period of a few years of how these people went from embracing these social justice ideas to then beginning a process of deconstructing their faith, even before it was called that. And so we watched, particularly we were friends with some people who went through a high profile deconstruction and completely left the faith. And it just really kind of rocked our world, because it was like, what is happening? And that sent me kind of on a quest to figure out what is the connection. It seemed like there was a connection between that and the social justice stuff, and that led me to kind of discover critical theory before kind of Neil Shinby was a household name. And I think I found him on Twitter, writing about this stuff when he had like 76 followers, and like, I gotta pull this guy up. This is important work that he's doing. And it wasn't until we moved back to Georgia that I really started doing something with this. It was all kind of personal research. And then this is about the time of MLK 50, and we started seeing these social justice ideas come into conservative, Bible teaching churches here in the South. And I'd kind of dismiss it as just a California thing. And it was like, no, this is showing up everywhere in the church. And I'd seen people walk that path, and I knew where it led. And so I just, began talking about it. And, I wrote some emails to, people in churches that, we were affiliated with here in the South. My pastor asked me to do a two-part equipping class on critical theory and social justice. And so I did that and got a good response. And, my wife encouraged me that you should make that a podcast, and it just kind of took off from there. So yeah, I think it's important for the church to really know how to respond to these issues.
Yeah. So you've been working, in those areas then for years. And, I wouldn't ask you to give like an overall assessment of where we stand with woke ideology and stuff, but you've seen a lot, happen, especially in recent years. Several guys have written books. Vodi Bakum wrote one, Owen Strahan wrote one. There's been several that have come out, and my general take on it is that a lot of the language changed. I'm not sure how much of the convictions changed, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit, but I noticed that a lot of the things people said, they started to say them differently or more carefully. Like the language that was being used was different. I don't know that necessarily always means that what people believe is necessarily changing so much as they're adapting their language. But like, what's your take on that? We've had a lot of reaction. There's been a lot of people that have spoken out against it. What sort of progress have we made, do you think?
Yeah, I think we're definitely in a better place as far as awareness of the fact that this is a problem. And I think, it's like with any sort of movement, the first people to speak are always kind of fearless. And with that fearlessness comes oftentimes a lack of concern for how things are said. And so it's always this interesting dynamic where people will be saying things, in a way that is, more brash, more, confrontational.
Right.
That causes people that are more concerned with respectability to kind of shy away from these issues, even though like quietly they're like, yeah, I agree, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to be associated with those people.
Right.
Which is frustrating. But I think there was a very real turn that I kind of date back to the last T4G conference, and I was there for that one. And Kevin DeYoung had a panel where they another black pastor and they talked about critical race theory. And Kevin DeYoung openly on the platform disagreed with a black pastor. And I feel like that was a turning point where this respectable, guy, Kevin DeYoung, stepping into it. And he wrote that, also wrote that great negative review of the reparations book. And I feel like that gave a lot of pastors the permission to okay, we can kind of address this, which is sad that so many people need that, permission from the kind of gatekeepers. But I think that just shows just all the work that went up to that moment. And you can get resentful, well, you were slamming us for saying this stuff 2 years ago. It's frustrating, but I think sometimes you got to take the wins where you can get them. And so now I think we're in a healthier spot, but I do think this whole thing has revealed almost much larger problems. And I think it's the task has kind of become less about warning about this one particular ideology and kind of pulling back and okay, what are the structural problems within evangelicalism that allowed this to really take off the way it did? And I think that's where Joe Rigney's doing great work with, talking about empathy. And that's, that untethered empathy is one thing that has, really let a lot of this sneak in. I think James Wood's been doing great work, critiquing winsomeness and just kind of that desire of for respectability. And so, I think it's a really interesting time in the church right now. And I think there's a lot of interesting work being done, kind of rethinking a lot of things we've just taken for granted.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up kind of Joe Rigney and James Woods' approach, because that's one question that I think is worthwhile with any sort of crisis or any sort of challenge like this, is like you said, backing off and seeing how is this led in the gates, and especially within some areas of Christianity that you would not expect. Maybe you look at a lot of very confessional or very reformed sectors of Christianity that seemed maybe even particularly vulnerable. You named a couple of them. I've heard people point out, maybe that there was a cowardice problem, and maybe that's true of some of those situations. Niceness, just this idea of nicety. But you pointed out respectability. I think that's one that's worth considering, especially moving forward, looking for, because there's always challenges, right? Looking to those next challenges that arise against the church is that desire for being respected, and not just respected among other Christians, kind of like you just described, looking over our shoulder. Is this okay for me to say something? But also looking to the world and having a desire for respectability. That seemed, at least from where I'm sitting, to play a huge role within that whole movement. Has that been part of your take on that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think interesting. I brought up Kevin DeYoung earlier. I guess, was it earlier this week? He released a critique of the Moscow Mood,
right,
and Doug Wilson, and just kind of the approach to cultural engagement that those guys, that they've decided to engage culture with. And it while I maybe I think there's some validity, and I know Doug Wilson has responded graciously to that. I think there's some, there's room for disagreement over the use of language and what's appropriate and what's not. But what struck me about that was so much of that piece was centered on, it really was about respectability. And this is not a respectable way to engage. And just the critique of using wokey McWoke face, which is just okay, that's just a disagreement. This is not a I don't know, a sin issue. And so I think what we're seeing just through that whole thing is that there's real cultural or maybe, I don't know, there's some type of momentum behind a cultural engagement that is not afraid of offending the world and offending Christians who might might be more timid in engaging the world. And I think that's what, probably prompted Kevin DeYoung to write that piece. Just because, I think the kind of Big Eva crowd recognizes that there's something happening there and we need to address it. And so this morning, someone sent me, there was a clip of Elon Musk going around asking him to respond to, advertisers that have pulled their funding from his platform. And to me, it was the best illustration of that kind of difference of different schools of thought within, conservative evangelicals, where he was just like, I don't, in much coarser language, I don't care. And he said,
yeah, that was a good PC summary that you just gave of
yeah.
what I saw him say.
Yeah. But he said, let the chips fall where they may.
Right.
And I feel like you've got two camps within conservative evangelicals, one that is like vigorously swinging away the axe at the, the Boniface option tree, that is like letting chips fly wherever, because this is like, we got to bring down the bales of our time.
Mm-hmm.
And another group that is taking these really soft swings because we don't want chips to get everywhere. We got to, make sure we're collecting the chips and putting them in the bin because we don't want to make a mess.
Right.
And I think, like Elon said at the end of that clip, he says, when he looks around the world, he sees a lot of people that want to be known for doing good while they're doing evil. And that is like, I'm not saying that, there's people within conservative evangelicals that are, trying to do evil, but there's a lot of evil that is being overlooked because we're afraid to let the chips fly and really attack it.
Yeah. So since you brought up the Kevin DeYoung article, let the record reflect, it wasn't me, it was you, Josh. But no, I think it's a good jumping off point, because I'm thinking, because we have to shoehorn you into eschatology because of this channel, right? So we're going to think about eschatology a little bit. But a lot of times this conversation is at least associated with certain eschatological groups. So just to throw it out there, a lot of times post-millennials are in general branded as more brash and more, and we could go through some of the kind of caricatures there. We can also recognize there's a lot of Christians who are being either red-pilled to a certain extent, just kind of seeing the way things are going and reacting to the way we've been responding. There's also a lot of black pills going down, which is not good. People despairing and maybe reacting in ways that are improper. But in all of that, you bringing up the Kevin DeYoung article, I'm thinking through, with your experience, you've done a lot of podcasting, you've done a lot of Twitter engagement, you've done a lot of social engagement, and that's kind of the focus of your ministry. I wonder how well we're doing with our approach as Christians, not just with the world outside. You mentioned, taking the axe to the tree, but also policing our own camp, responding to differences within our own camp. Part of the pushback to the Kevin DeYoung piece, and I don't think it's an unfair pushback, is to look through some of the recent things that have come out of the organization which he serves on the board of with TGC, and just to observe, there's been some very strange things. There's been helpful things over the years, for sure. I think most of us could attest to that. But you read articles, talking about the gospel according to Taylor Swift, or you're reading an article talking about Christ in the church, and all of a sudden it gets, X-rated, sexually graphic, and they pull the article. There's a little bit of question as to why certain moods are so offensive to those within Christendom. What's been some of your take on that? Maybe the progress that Christians are making, maybe in as far as engaging the world around us and engaging those within our own camps. Pros, cons, where are we doing well? Where are we not doing well? What's been your take on that, Josh?
Yeah, there's definitely. I don't think you can avoid. I hate that language of moods, but if we're gonna label one group having a mood, all the different groups have moods. Desiring God has a mood. TGC has a mood. It's a thing. And I think I think it really comes down to, and I think you can trace a lot of this back to Tim Keller's approach to reaching the city, and that kind of New York focused ministry that a lot of people just kind of took as the default ministry everywhere. And I think a lot of people in the evangelical church, particularly in these parachurch organizations, the Big Eva, if you want to call it that, they have a kind of they've got kind of a target audience in mind, and it's often a upwardly mobile, I don't know, cultural elite. The people you'd find in cities that are, trying, coming up in like the entertainment industry or in corporate America, and everything they do is geared towards reaching that type of person. And I think that's where a lot of this like desire of respectability comes from, because these are the people they want to reach. And like, they look over at Doug Wilson, and he's like the meme with the golfer, I forget his name, but just loud and brash, and it's like, whoa, you're hurting
Daily and
Daily, yeah. And it's like you're making our job of reaching this type of people, you're making it more difficult. And I think that's where I kind of I talk a lot about how we've really got an idol of evangelism. And what I mean by that is that we have an idol, as John Piper says, is anything that we look to provide what only God can provide. And so we've gotten so smart with like our diagonalization and contextualization and the middle way and all this stuff, that we think we know, if we can present the gospel in this way to this crowd, that will make them more likely to convert and to give, the gospel a hearing. And that's looking to our efforts, our evangelization efforts and strategies to produce what only God can provide, namely conversions. And I think what the Moscow guys and others that kind of get in the craw of Big Eva, they've just started saying the truth, and regardless of the consequences, regardless of how it's seen. And I think that bothers them, because they see them as an obstacle to their evangelistic work. And I think the last several years have been really encouraging on the evangelism front, as people we never would have expected to get saved are re-examining, and a lot of the red pilling politically is leading people to rethink other things in their life that they've kind of just taken for granted. I've heard countless stories of people who, once they re-examined their politics and went from a woke leftist to a conservative, they continue that process and re-examine the Bible and come to a saving faith. And it's like, it shouldn't work that way with our paradigms of like who we're trying to reach and who we're trying to make the gospel palatable to. A hardcore Trump supporter is not someone we're trying to reach, but that's who we're seeing come to faith right now. God's doing work everywhere. Right. But I think the more that we can kind of recognize that it's the gospel that changes lives, it's not our presentation of the gospel. The more that I think that frees us up to engage the culture in a way that is not fearful, that is not concerned with respectability, because we know that our gospel fueled engagement with culture is going to bear fruit. It's not, if we stop caring about, no, we have to reach this particular person, this type of person. No, we're going to go out there. We're going to engage the culture, standing on the word of God, and trust that the Holy Spirit is going to open the ears of the people God has elected to hear. And, we got to stop, looking to our own ingenuity to make converts.
Yeah. I wonder, you talking about that, I wonder, well, let me ask the question, and then I'll give you kind of walk through it a little bit. My question is, I wonder how much you see eschatology in general kind of driving these conversations and the way people are responding to them. So, you and I were talking a little bit before, and I understand there's many good Christians who are much smarter than I am, that eschatology is not a huge focus. Like, it's not, they wouldn't describe it as a driving factor for them or something that they necessarily want to, talk a lot about. But in general, Christians have a general, eschatology, right? Like if you were to ask somebody, hey, are things, are they trending up or trending down? Like, there's a general take on what this story looks like and what we should kind of expect of our experience in it. We're all optimistic if we're Orthodox because Christ returns and he sets all things right. But what it looks like leading up to that. I just wonder, with you talking about these things with social engagement, with kind of our outlook on the whole red pill phenomenon and all these things, do you see eschatology kind of being a driving factor? And if not a driving factor, maybe even people tend or trend towards certain responses within those camps? Because I think we could probably both agree there's many Christians that respond in ways that have very little to do with their actual theology. You hear them explain their theology, but the things they do in life in any regard may or may not line up with that theology. But do you see that dynamic at play here, that a general eschatology being a driving force, or at least a force that's sufficient to categorize some of these responses?
Yeah, it's certainly part of the conversation. I grew up Left Behind. I thought the three views of eschatology were pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib. Everything else was I didn't even know what to do with it. So
you are not alone, by the way. We've heard this story.
Yeah. So for me, it's something that I know I need to spend some time in study. So I've kind of put a pin in. It's on my to-do list. I'm not sure where I land, which is kind of goes against the narrative that a lot of people want to kind of dismiss. Like, if you're concerned about cultural engagement, you're just post-trib, or no, post-mill. Right. And if because I'm not post-mill, then I'm not concerned with that, and I can just dismiss all of your concerns about cultural engagement. And my position is, like, it shouldn't, even if post-trib is wrong, and we're in the, or post-mill is wrong, and we're in the pre-mill or a-mill, whatever. We don't know how much longer we've got, and history over time ebbs and flows. And we've had periods in history that have been worse than we're experiencing now. We've had periods in history that have been better than we're experiencing right now. And so, out of love for our neighbor in a self-governing country like we live in, we have a Christian duty to be engaged in culture, to be engaged in politics, because we love our neighbors. And so, regardless of the long term, are things getting better, things getting worse, we just need to be obedient and not be so pessimistic within our lifetimes. Like, you can be pessimistic long term, okay, but we don't know how close we are to the return of Christ. So for right now, let's be obedient, let's be faithful. There's no reason to think that God could not be calling up another generation of Wilberforce, where God used Wilberforce and his constant, faithful advocacy on the issue of slavery to change the hearts of unrepentant, unregenerate people in Britain. And there's no reason God could not do that now. I think a lot of people kind of dismiss, like, oh, we could never have change in America unless majority of the country becomes Christian, and because of my eschatology, I know that's not going to happen. So what's the point? Just focus on your local church and just ignore the rest of the world. And it's like, God throughout Scripture delighted in using small numbers to do big things. Right. And there's no reason we should not expect that today in America. We're not guaranteed that, no, but God can do it, and we should act like we serve a God that can do that and loves to show up on behalf of the oppressed and the most vulnerable among us, which right now are the unborn.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the unborn. We've got to get to that topic. It's just listening to you talk about that, though. It's funny because you were kind of admitting kind of a there's a pin in the wall, right? Like just kind of working through eschatology still. You're not going to wear a T-shirt with a certain camp on it, and that's good. I think though, I don't know if anybody's used this term before, but I was just thinking of kind of a pessimistic immediacy. I think if I was to think of a lot of, especially American Christians, their eschatology would have been, at least in previous decades, it's a pessimistic immediacy. In other words, like it has to be bad, and his Christ's return has to be soon. And they may admit, if you were to push one of them, they probably would have admitted like, oh, okay, he doesn't have to. But the way they lived their lives was like, Christ will return before I die, and it's all going to get worse till then. And then their actions then reflected that kind of pessimistic immediacy. And that shows the fruit in the things you were just describing, sort of an apathy toward culture and a lackadaisical approach toward even evangelism, church planning, like all the normal things. It was just kind of like, well, we'll just kind of hunker down, batter down the hatches, and bury some gold in the backyard and hope it pans out.
Mm-hmm. I think I saw Jeff Durbin say once that when he was growing up, he was convinced that Jesus was coming back, and his one concern was, am I going to be able to get married and have sex before he comes back? And it's like, yeah, I identified with that. That was my growing up. It's like, oh, I want him to come back, but give me like a couple years.
Right.
It's like I'd
like to take a wife first. This would be
yes.
Good. Yeah. That's just an honest young man. Yeah. That's funny. But before we get into some of the other stuff, I wanted to talk about the article you wrote on Christian nationalism, which it was funny to me because I saw you'd written the article, you labeled it, I think the subtitle was a layman's view or a layman's explanation, something to that effect. So it was intended to be a lay level approach, and I saw somebody had commented on your article. They were like, nope, you used words like eschatology, and I checked out right then, and I had to have a little bit of a chuckle because it was very simply written, right? Like, but you have to use a couple of terms, you have to use a little bit of qualifiers. But how did you find that article? What's been some of the response that you've heard to that? I know there's been some at least more encouraging developments with Christian nationalism and that surrounding conversation. David Schrock and Christ Overall, they did a whole series of interviews, and whether you agree with him on everything or not, like there's a lot to benefit from those interviews. They did a great job. But what's been some of the takeaways and pushback or feedback you've gotten from that article?
Well, I didn't realize comments were on in that. I'll have to go check that out. No, I've gotten largely just positive response from that. And I think, the guys at Christ Overall have done a phenomenal job. That's what's been most encouraging to me is just that it seems like we've stepped into a new phase of the discourse where some serious voices are acknowledging that, okay, this seems to be a thing. Let's talk about it seriously. Let's really examine it. Because so many of these things, they start online and it's kind of raucous,
Right.
It can get out of hand sometimes with the memes flying back and forth. But, I was hoping to do with that piece is just kind of elevate the conversation and say, like, here's what, the anti-Christian nationalists here's their position, and present it fairly. And here's the pro-Christian nationalists and the different flavors of it. And so, I've gotten good response from it. So I hope people are finding it helpful.
I wonder, do you plan to do any follow-up on that topic?
I'm sure I will at some point. I'm taking a Twitter fast right now, but I'll be back in January, and I'm sure
your soul will be better for that fast. It will benefit.
It's killing me right now. People keep sending me things, and I'm like, oh, I want to jump in on that.
That's the whole problem. Yeah, you stay on it because you have to keep up, and then it just kind of is sad sometimes. But no, like one of the things I was encouraged with you doing that. Many of us I would consider myself very sympathetic to many who claim the title of Christian nationalist. I don't like the title. I have some hesitations, probably some of the same ones I heard Joe Boot speak about as far as just that nationalism, the freight that comes with that title. But again, there's a lot to work through there. But I think one of the things I appreciated about you aiming for a layman explanation is, number one, it was sufficiently deep, like there was depth behind it. It wasn't just, wasting time, but it was also just worded in a way that somebody can really encounter that. Specifically, you mentioned people in churches that this would start to affect. I think you need that, and you need the more, maybe a little bit more sussed out academic approach that I think Dave Schrock kind of struck over there. Andy Naselli wrote his kind of taxonomy on it, and you're talking about Doiveridian Doiveridian approaches to society. That might be a bit much for some people. I feel like we need both for that conversation to move forward. That was one of the things I was really encouraged by, was you trying to take that substance, kind of presented at a lower shelf level.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that too was like informed by just my experience, watching the whole woke thing play out in local churches, and hearing stories of, people concerned about, wokeness being automatically labeled as racist and kind of driven out of their churches because they dared to question, Black Lives Matter, or whether or not, we should be celebrating this or that. And and so as I recognize that, okay, this Christian nationalist thing is going to become a bigger conversation, it's going to start showing up in the local church. I really wanted to kind of help, pastors and church leaders think about that before, the accusations started, flying, and the concern, started getting, affecting people in the pews.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious, Josh, because I wonder how reactionary you take this whole thing to be, because that's been some of the pushback. Some people have said, this whole conversation on Christian nationalism and even theonomy to a related extent, and really these conversations I've heard the pushback of are just kind of reactions against sort of that negative world dynamic. I know I've heard you speak about that before as well. Aaron Wren's kind of positive, neutral, negative world dynamic. I find some substance in that. I think there is some reactionary impetuses there. I also think that there's a lot to be said for reactions. If you were to think of any, major flashpoint within Christendom, you can usually, point to something that happened and a reaction against it. And then all of a sudden you have a council, or you have, whatever it is that is the church's reaction to it. But how reactionary do you take it? And do you take that to be a positive, a negative? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I definitely think the term itself is a bit reactionary. It's not something that we came up with for ourselves. Some would probably
the Christian nationalism moniker.
The Christian nationalism moniker that was assigned to us by the media, and I think a lot of us kind of looked around and was like, okay, hey guys, they're calling this Christian nationalist now. Cool,
right?
And but I think, I would say the movement, and it's still kind of a nascent, it's kind of still forming. I would say the movement itself is not reactionary. It's trying to be constructive. For years, the criticism of Christians, particularly with regards to cultural engagement, is, you're just known for what you're against. Like, what are you for? And Christian nationalism, as it appears to be kind of coalescing, is an attempt to articulate, like, what are we for? Like, what is our positive vision for the future? Mm-hmm. And I think that transition into negative world has really clarified a lot of things that we are, particularly, that the myth of a neutral, secular, public square, it was just that. It was an illusion all along, and you can't have laws and a society that's based on neutrality. It's always based on a underlying moral framework of right and wrong, and recognizing that that's the fact. Well, we Christians should be aiming to make our moral framework that our society is running on a Christian moral framework. And I think that, to me, is like, if I were to distill my aspirations with what some would call Christian nationalism. Again, I'm like you, I go back and forth on the term itself. I just want Christians to recover the will to govern according to a Christian moral framework. That it's right and good to ban drag queens from the local library, and you don't have to celebrate that as a blessing of liberty because, well, we want to speak there, so they have to speak there too. Like, no, one is morally wrong and should be banned. And Christians just need to become comfortable with that.
Yeah. I like the way you framed it as a sort of positive construction, as opposed to just the negative, which you could probably say you need both, right? Like the is wrong, the negative assessment, but also the positive vision, because I've heard some of the pushback against, and again, when I say Christian nationalism, I'm at this point lumping in everybody, right? Because they just view, like you said, every Christian with a view toward the gospel impacting anything really outside the church house walls, they're labeling as a Christian nationalist. But a lot of the pushback has been that it's sort of Christian LARPing or, live action role playing. This is make believe. How can you sit amidst a seemingly spiraling or crumbling Western culture and be talking about anything like Christian nationhood or Christendom or any of those things? And you're pointing out that it's just it's the vision towards something positive. Yes, things might be crumbling apart. We have to have a vision. Then what do you build from those building blocks?
Yeah, what are we aiming at? And I think, with regards to a Christian nation in our lifetimes, that probably is a bit of wishful thinking. But with that aim in mind, though, this is what Christian governance looks like. There's no reason why we couldn't have that in local context. Like I think Christian localism is probably a much more achievable, probably palatable idea if we were to, really take local communities. Moscow's trying to do their thing up there, but it doesn't need to be limited there. There's plenty of places throughout the U.S. where Christians, if they became engaged in their local communities, could make a huge difference. And then, just that, if you want to talk about the free market of ideas, when you see these communities thriving and these communities, sliding further into despair, well, what's the difference? Well, this one is explicitly based on Christian moral framework, and they govern that way, and they acknowledge that Christ is Lord. Okay, then those ideas look appealing to non-Christians over here because, dang, this isn't working what we're doing, and you can just kind of begin to see like how this could begin to, reshape the country, and it doesn't have to be a top-down thing where if we just get the right guy in White House, then things will change. Like, no, it's time to get engaged on the local level and, get some skin in the game and start caring about the right things.
I think the local level is kind of indicative of something I'm pretty sure I saw you pointed out a couple of times on Twitter, on X, but that sort of dynamic of picking the easy targets and how that's sort of been the kind of the modus operandi of a lot of Christian, especially leaders, has been to kind of pick at the easy targets, but not to address those really poignant issues. It was in the context of LARPing was when I saw something about this, but it was essentially what went through my mind was that for it seems that many of those with a voice to speak within Christianity have been picking at the smaller targets and not addressing the Pope. If they're Martin Luther and the Pope is there, like they're not actually speaking to the Pope. They're finding the easy targets along the wayside and picking fights with them when there's a literal battle to be fought in front of them. But it seems that has turned a little bit. I wonder what your take is on that, as far as maybe either Christian leaders beginning to recognize some of these, especially cultural battles, for what they are and addressing them, even if we don't all agree, working through those issues. Or is it maybe that people are listening to other voices within Christianity that weren't as prevalent previously? What's your general take on that?
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a shift happening. The Gospel Coalition is still a thing, but I don't think it has near the influence it once had, 2-3 years ago. And so I think there's kind of a, they talk a lot about the great sort in the country with people moving. I think there's a bit of that happening in the evangelical world. I think with new institutions being created, like Christ Over All and American Reformer, I think there's a lot happening right now. It's an exciting time to be involved in kind of evangelical, I don't know, institutions, and there's a lot of building happening, and I think that's exciting.
No, I like it, especially with the local context, like you said. That is often the, when you're talking about challenges, that's usually the hardest challenge for people to face. It's a lot easier to talk about, what's across the pond or something, but what's in my own backyard is usually the biggest, but it's usually the best target, I think, for us to have as Christians. Mm-hmm. That's an encouraging trend. Josh, we had several other topics. My list of notes to talk through with you was quite more extensive, but we probably need to wrap it up. Maybe we can have you on another time, but where can people follow you? Where can people keep up with what you're writing, what projects you have going on? Where are you at?
Yeah. Best place to find me is on, I guess, X. It's still hard to say that.
Is that going to stick around, by the way? Because I keep waiting for them to just say, nah, we're just kidding. It's Twitter.
I know. I think it'll always be Twitter to me, but
yep.
You can find me there at Josh Daws. Again, I'm taking a Twitter fast until the new year, but I'll be back and raring to go. The podcast is the Great Awakening Podcast. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. It's also on YouTube if you want to see video of me and my guests. So
fantastic. Well, Josh, thank you so much, man. This has been encouraging, and appreciate you stopping by and chatting some eschatology with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.